Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Ardless webinar series. My name is Richard Roberts, Solutions Architect here at Ardless. Thank you for joining us for today for the You Need a Plan for CMMC. Today I am joined by Ardless President Michael Specca to discuss how to go about developing a plan for CMMC. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar. They will be addressed when they come through if we have time. If not, we'll get to them during the Q&A session of this webinar. Also note that if we don't get to your question today, an Ardless representative will reach out to you to answer your question directly after the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and it will be shared with you after today's session. So if you do have a question though, and it doesn't make it into the question Q&A time, or you didn't get a chance to ask the question, please take down this email address, marketing@ardless.com. And then what you'll do is submit that question to marketing@ardless.com, and we will get to you with the answer to that question. So without any further ado, let's jump into it and get started. I'll turn it over to Michael Specca.
Hey, thanks, Rich. I just want to echo Rich's calls for questions. Appreciate y'all being here. This is really your time, so we'll do our best to pause the presentation and get any questions you have. Prefer this to be as much of a discussion as it can be, rather than just a straight presentation. So it's kind of crunch time here for CMMC. We've got rules out. We've got more coming. We're seeing a big uptick in people who are interested in getting started. Of the people we've been working with up until now, they're scheduling assessments, doing pre-assessments. So the plans, the program's really rolling out, and a lot of organizations are now saying, okay, well, we know we need to do this, we know we're gonna take it seriously, but how? That's the purpose of today's conversation, to try to give you guys a bit of a roadmap on the how. So we'll just get started by talking about a very, very high level approach to a plan. We'll go through these 5 issues, and then we'll try to dig into, if we've got enough time, we'll try to dig into different approaches to thinking about these particular items. So obviously, the first thing you got to figure out is what CMMC level you're going for. If you looked at this a couple of years ago under CMMC 1, there were 5 levels. Now we're down to 3. So selecting your level is going to be an important initial consideration. Are you going to roll it all out at once, or are you going to take individual steps? And we've got a lot more material on trying to figure out those individual steps towards the back half of this system. Understanding your scope is going to be critical. Even the pre-assessments and assessments we're helping our customers with today start with, okay, how are we defining the scope? What is it that the assessor is assessing? So knowing what in your organization needs to be covered is important. Then there's technology selections, and then how are you going to resource the whole thing. So we'll go into these again at a fairly high level, one at a time, and then we'll get into some detailed considerations. Okay, CMMC levels. Originally 5. These got condensed down to these 3 levels. Level 1 with 17 practices just requires a self-assessment. It's the easiest level to achieve. It's also the basic level that all government contractors need to be performing at. So if you haven't looked at level 1, that's definitely something that you need to be doing. So I would definitely start there at a minimum. The level that most organizations are pursuing is level 2. This is where a lot of the conversation in the market is. A lot of the rulemaking has been focused on level 2. Level 2 is aligned with NIST SP 800-171. This is a requirement that has been around for quite a few years, since 2017. So it's in line with things that you've probably already been doing some of. The big change here with CMMC is that you're going to get these, for the most part, third-party assessments. So that's the main bulk of the activity we see in the market. Level 3 has additional practices. These just came out. at the end of last year in the new rule as to what practices would need to be applied to reach level 3. And this is going to be for organizations that are dealing with some of the most sensitive controlled unclassified information. We do have some customers that are looking into level 3, working on their level 3 plans. So it's definitely real. It's definitely out there. But again, the bulk of companies that we talk to are worried about level 2. And again, if you have questions about any of these things along the way, feel free to throw them in the chat. So the bulk of the back half of this webinar is about multiple steps. We talked already about the difference between level 1 and level 2. CMMC 1.0 had this intermediate level that was really, about getting ready for an assessment. That concept still isn't a bad one. If you've got time, if you don't need, to be compliant right away, but you don't want to, go through too much change too quickly, maybe incur too much cost too quickly, you can always look at the old definition of this intermediate level and use that as a guide for controls that you want to put in place. There's other questions about multiple steps, which really have to do with how much of your organization, how fast the rest of your organization needs to be put in place that we'll talk about a little bit more. Your scoping question is really the big one, and there is a published scoping guide on the DoD's CMMC website, which really gets down to what kind of assets do you have and which of those assets are going to be storing, transmitting, or processing controlled unclassified information. As far as the government's concerned, those are the systems that you need to protect that are in scope. But while you're thinking about your scope, you probably also want to think about your own intellectual property, your own systems that maybe you don't necessarily use to store, transmit, or process CUI, but that are valuable to you, and what kind of security controls you want to have in place in order to protect those. There is a category in the scoping diagram of contractor risk managed assets, which basically, in short, boils down to the government is going to want to know what you're doing to protect related systems to the ones that that you are using for CUI work. And while they don't assess them, they do have the option to look at them if you don't have any good answers about those systems. So you certainly want to at least be able to talk to those systems, even if they don't necessarily strictly meet 800.171.
First question of the day, Mike.
All right.
First question comes up. How soon should I start planning for CMMC compliance if I don't have any CUI yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, if you're attending this and you're interested in CMMC, you're considering government contracting, right, as a line of work, or you do have government clients or prime contractors that aren't asking you to be ready yet. Maybe they don't think that the contracts that you're working on are gonna come under the new rule in, let's say, the first year, because the government does have a phased rollout. So it probably depends on a couple of different factors. I would start planning now because it depends on how hard it's going to be ready, right? If you're a manufacturing firm that's going to have to make significant changes to your shop floor, those are things that you don't want to find out 30 days or 60 days before you're trying to start manufacturing a part or a series of parts that you've got a lot of changes to make. So at least starting the planning now is certainly worthwhile. The other question that I would ask is, how soon are you looking to bid on contracts that require CUI? We've got customers who are coming to us because they don't have CUI today, but a contract that they're bidding on requires access to CUI to prepare a response, that portions of the response might be considered CUI. And of course, if you don't have a system where you can capture that data and generate the new data, then you're not going to be able to do the bidding. So, there's also that question of, what's your sales strategy? So I would be looking at those two things. What's your sales strategy, and, what's the likelihood that it's going to be difficult or time consuming to get through a change? And the longer you think that's going to be based on your, the particulars of your business, the sooner you should start. Remember, your competitors are doing it now, so that's also, a worthwhile question to ask yourself, um, because there are customers in just about every segment of government contracting that we've spoken to, from staff augmentation, out to manufacturing, construction, um, aerospace, lots of different firms where people are going out there and getting the certification done in order to be able to say we're ready. And at a certain point, that's going to be a competitive advantage. If you want to weigh the specifics of your organization, feel free to set up an appointment with us, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it and help you try to figure out when you ought to move out.
Sort of a second part to that question, kind of tagged on there. What happens if I'm not compliant when a new contract requiring CMMC is awarded to me?
Well, you've got to have. I mean, that's it's an interesting question. I would think that you wouldn't be able to get the award without demonstrating that you met, at least, had an SPRS score that said you were, capable of getting through a certification. So self-reporting, at least, that you were ready for an assessment. Um, but if you're not ready, there are a couple of providers. We're one that have some pretty quick to implement, um, new environments. These are, ours is cloud-based, so you'd get on a Microsoft cloud and be able to at least start your initial work that way. Um, again, sort of depending on the complexity of your work, if you're really talking about processing a handful of diagrams or, writing a few documents, reading a few documents, um, there are providers like us who can get you a special purpose enclave to do that, to get started with. So, certainly reach out to a provider or a couple of providers and see what they have to say in terms of their ability to get you up and running relatively quickly. Um, and then, you got to figure out how much bigger this work's going to be, right? We do have customers that it's a fairly small percentage of their overall business, and so they keep a pretty small enclave that's really special purpose for just a certain kind of work, and then others that are, this is the beginning of transforming their company, and they're going to evolve this special purpose enclave into where their entire organization runs over time. So, um, it's possible. Just reach out. Rich, anything else there?
Oh, go ahead.
You're muted. No,
Yeah.
okay. All right. So yeah, great questions. Thanks for those. This question of what systems do you need to protect is kind of tied pretty tightly to that question of, what do I need to do if I get a contract right away? If we can have just a handful of systems where you can at least get to work, that can help a lot. Technology choices also invariably drive, a lot of these decisions. I will say too often they're the main driver of the decision, as opposed to the secondary driver of the decision. So 800.171, while it does have a lot of technical controls, is not purely a set of technical controls, right? There's also procedures, processes requirements, personnel requirements, physical security requirements. And even a number of the technical requirements, having the technology that you could activate and use in order to operate in a compliant and secure manner is different than actually using it to operate in a compliant and secure manner. So we find customers have the best success when they, put some energy into the conversations we have with them about risk assessments, about business requirements, right? Your business requirements create your asset and technology needs. The technology needs are the things that have risks. And then the program's designed to mitigate those risks. If you just start with, what do I have? Sometimes you don't necessarily have the right things. Sometimes you haven't really thought about the things that are going to make you operate smoothly and competitively in the future. And you can wind up putting a lot of time and energy into setting up controls in a way that doesn't really help you work. And that's where security gets a bad rap, right? Like, oh, it's the business prevention department showing up to make it hard for me to do my job. It doesn't have to be that way, but in order for it to not be that way, you do need to think about what the business needs are. But invariably, at the end of the day, we're going to be implementing controls on technology, and what technology you're picking has a lot to do with how fast that's going to go. Resourcing. So there's a number of different skill sets that you're going to need in the organization. We'll talk towards the end of the webinar about different sources for these. But just to go down them off this slide, there's obviously the question of who's translating the business requirements into the technical requirements. So that's going to be this CISO type role. Pardon me. You need a security architecture. That's probably the thing that's easiest to outsource if you just want to outsource a piece of the puzzle, is to have someone come in and help you design an architecture. You got to configure and harden those systems. MSPs can do that, consultants can do that, your own internal staff can do that. Staying on top of the configurations can get burdensome and take up a bunch of time for internal staff. So is the logging, monitoring, reporting, alerting, right? This is the typically met by a managed security service provider or a managed detection and response provider that'll look for bad news and then act on it if they find it. You are also going to want to think about your operational support, whether that comes from a managed service provider or internal staff. A couple of considerations there. One is, CUI is a U.S. person's only access. So if your managed service providers currently are offshore, you're going to want to make sure you've got support that is onshore, is a U.S. person's only. Also, when it comes to matters of security and compliance, the team that's supporting your systems needs to know how to support those systems in a compliant way. So there are controls around maintenance of the systems, and making sure when you perform that maintenance that you're reinforcing, preserving the baselines and the security configurations that you have. So make sure that you're thinking about your cybersecurity program and your cybersecurity compliance requirements as in the same breath as your operational support, because those two things are going to be tightly intertwined.
Here we go, Mike. We got a question going back a slide here. We were talking about enclaves. Question
Sure.
is, how long should I expect a compliant enclave to take to set up?
Okay. So, we talk to people whose plans are, anywhere from 3 months to 12 months. But again, it also depends on the technology that you need to put in the enclave. We've gotten customers with very simple requirements ready in as quickly as 4 weeks. Our typical time to convert an environment is about 3 months. But we've invested a lot in different techniques to make that process go quickly. Folks that we talk to when we're looking at their internal plans are usually measured in 3, 6 month, quarterly half year increments, up to a year. There are again ways to do that faster, and there's ways to break down what you're doing into different stages so you can be ready to do certain kinds of work relatively quickly. But in general, if you're talking about going from everything I have now in a non-compliant environment to everything that I have now in a compliant environment, that's a 3 to 6 month process.
So then the second part to that, kind of following on what you're saying, if I start small, will my compliance cost increase significantly as I scale up for larger contracts?
Cost. Okay. So I'm actually trying to develop a webinar specifically on financial implications of all of this. But just to touch on that briefly here, like any other investment, right, you're going to have your you're going to have your upfront or your baseline costs, and then you're going to have your unit costs. So as you grow, unit costs ought to drop. Um, for example, as a provider, we have volume discounts, right? If you have a lot of users in your environment, the price per user goes down. So you shouldn't see a big growth in costs. You can also distribute your fixed costs across, all of those users or all of those endpoints and devices. Most of the solutions that we put in place are cloud-based. There is a base cost for configuring and managing that cloud. Once you develop the baselines and put them in that cloud, though, those baselines can apply to one endpoint or 100 endpoint or 1,000 endpoints. And so the cost per endpoint should drop over time. You got to compare that against the soft costs that you're looking at, typically in the form of efficiencies. A conversation that we very commonly have with customers is, well, I don't want to necessarily pay to get everybody on the environment. And the first question we ask is, okay, well, how separated is the workforce? Because if everybody needs to work together all the time, then you're going to incur a lot of, potentially incur a lot of inefficiencies by having a portion of that workforce on a separate system. So the solution there tends to be everybody on the non-compliant system with just a small portion of the workforce having some sort of access, usually web-based or cloud-based, to the compliant system. And that works okay if you've got a pretty small group of people who work on the compliant work, and they're interacting frequently enough with the rest of the company that they want to be in their commercial environment, or their non-compliant environment as opposed to the controlled environment. But if everybody truly works on everything all the time, then the costs of either context switching between the two systems or the costs of giving everybody access to both, even in a limited controlled environment, usually adds up to more than what you're paying with moving everybody. And that cost is definitely going to increase as you scale, because you're just going to have more people needing to be in two places at once. And that can be a very frustrating operational environment. If there's anyone on the call who's done industrial security work, where you have no choice but to be on systems at different levels, that can get pretty burdensome in a hurry. Does that answer the question, you think, Rich? You're on mute again, by the way.
If I come off mute. Yes, absolutely. That answers the question.
Okay, great. All right, appreciate the questions. Please keep them coming. We'll move along though. So in terms of putting your plan together, once we sort of understand that these are the different things we need to think about, what level, what scope, what systems, right? What technology are we using? What resources do we have available? Then there's really the question of, which part of our organization or which parts of the organization. Rich, you got another one coming in?
Yes, I apologize, Michael, for jumping in, but a question along cost. So this question is a follow-up to the cost question, which is, what do you suggest for companies that are seeking level 3 but have services that are not FedRAMP certified or cannot financially afford applications like GCC High Office products?
Yeah, that's tough. Probably, something that we should have a direct conversation about to understand what you do and where your constraints are. I mean, there could be answers for, on-premises, on-premises systems and kind of more traditional security measures. That does put a lot of physical security requirements, a lot of system maintenance requirements on you. So I don't know if in the long run it would necessarily be cheaper. But yeah, that's a pretty interesting case. Most of the solutions that are out there are going to be based on, moving to something provided by Microsoft, Amazon, Google that is compliant, or at least an environment that's got a baseline compliancy to it that you can build upon. And a big part of the projects we work on with customers where they are using SaaS products is looking for and planning for a migration to FedRAMP versions of those SaaS products. And in one place we've seen a lot of challenges there is in construction, because there's lots of construction quoting automation, estimation tools, project planning tools that a lot of businesses pretty much run on, and there are no good FedRAMP solutions that folks can find. So you're definitely looking at some change management there if the business operates on a product that that primarily that everybody needs and doesn't have a FedRAMP option for it. But there is an amount of business process engineering that we can talk about. A number of customers that we've worked with, we've seen significant cost reductions with really not even a ton of business process changes. So we have a manufacturing customer that originally specified a plan to go, big bang, everyone all at once, as this slide is saying. They did everyone all at once, and a year later they came back to us and said, we don't think we can renew because this program is just too expensive. But after looking at what their business processes were, we were able to segment the organization and save them, well over 50%. I think it was 60-70% of their costs by identifying the key roles that needed access to the compliant environment, finding ways that we could get some shared access to the compliant environment. Really tightening up their physical controls. So in this case, they could use printed travelers on their shop floor, which cut a ton of users that ordinarily, that they thought would need access and no longer did. So I would say, let's take a look at your business operations and see how we can segment the organization to get you that level of compliance without necessarily creating too high a cost. Because a small group of GCC high users is typically not a ton of money. It's when you have to put everybody on there that it can start to get pricey. But yeah, follow up with us. I'd love to just meet with you one-on-one and understand your constraints. How's the queue look, Rich? Should I keep going, or we got some others coming in?
Nope, keep rolling. Good.
Okay. All right. So everyone all at once is pretty, pretty easy to understand. So we won't go into it in a ton of detail moving on from here. But I will say it's got a lot of advantages if the price is right. We do spend time with customers who will spend 2-3 months working with us in the pre-sales engineering process to try to come up with ways to segment or phase their implementation. And when they look at the business impact of it, they ultimately say, whatever money we're going to save in hard costs of licensing or services from us, we're just going to turn around and pay those in decreased efficiency, decreased employee morale, rework, that it's just not worth the effort. So I would say for every story like the one we told you where we were able to save this company a ton of money after a year, there's another story where they just decided it wasn't worth it, and they went ahead and moved everyone all at once. So while that approach may seem unpalatable out of the gate, I'd say you got a 50-50 shot that the organization's workflows, especially again if lots of people work together on lots of different things, it's very difficult to do anything other than everyone all at once. But for plenty of companies, the segmented or phased approaches do wind up making sense. And so segmentation, just to for us to agree on our terms. Here we're just talking about breaking things up, what roles need access, what systems need access, what departments need access. Is it just supervisors? Is it just the engineering team, right? How do we look at different segments? Now, obviously, if you're a larger organization that's got both a commercial wing and a or department and a federal department, that's a really clear line, especially if those two organizations don't share personnel very often. That's a pretty basic example of the segmented approach. In a phased approach, we're really trying to get everyone, but we're not going for all at once. And so this is about adding, different groups to the environment over time. So let's dig into some of these different considerations. So obviously budget, and I think we've talked about budget a lot, so I won't dwell on this too much. But this is really about, again, balancing your soft costs with the hard system costs. It's really easy to look at a quote for GCC High or a quote for services from a firm like us, or an internal staffing plan to bring in the internal personnel that you would need, the expertise you would need to do this with your own team, and say, oh, that's X thousands of dollars. We've got to cut that. And like I said, again, oftentimes, even after going down that path, companies come to the conclusion that the soft costs aren't worth it. So make sure you're looking at both. But when we get into parts of the organization, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on, I think, the next slide or two. We don't necessarily need all the systems to be compliant. So there's a control in 800.171 called control CUI flow, which is really a control about understanding data flows in your organization. So where's the CUI coming from? Do you generate it internally? Where does it need to go inside the organization? So who needs to handle it? And then if you're sending it out of the organization, either back to the government or to your own subcontractors, how does it get out of the organization? Doing a CUI flow analysis really helps you identify some of the more nuanced access requirements. So the success story that I was quoting earlier, what we realized is that there's some engineers who do CUI designs for the manufacturing floor. There's some supervisors and quality control personnel that need to access plans that are marked CUI and direct personnel from the system. But by putting a few kiosks on the manufacturing floor that supervisors could access, and by asking the engineers to only do their CUI engineering work on their personal systems in their offices, we were able to cut a ton of systems and a number of roles out of the CUI flow. Once they're out of the CUI flow, they don't have to be compliant anymore, because again, 800.171 is all about protecting CUI. So that CUI flow analysis is a great way to get a clearer picture on maybe some of the less obvious segments, those role-based segments, those workflow-based segments, and a CUI flow analysis, for what it's worth, I'll do a quick little plug for us. That's part of our pre-sales engineering process. So, we'll look at that with you at no cost if you want to dig into that more with us. The bigger ones, which we'll talk about some of the pros and cons. Again, the departmental one's pretty easy. This is the only department that deals with federal work. Sometimes those departments are role-based or workflow-based, so the engineering department needs it, the purchasing department doesn't. Projects are another big one. Here's our, the organization. We really, or if you look at our org chart, there's a headquarters and then there's different project groups, and these projects need to handle CUI and these don't. That's another way to do that. And one of the interesting things about the project-based approach, and I'm going to jump slides here because I think we have more of this later in the presentation, is that you can figure out, remember we were talking about unit costs earlier, those unit costs can be something that's based on the projects that you're going to bid, and you'll know what it costs to have a compliant environment access for personnel that are going to go on a project, and you can take that into consideration in your bidding. And then you really want to either make sure your internal processes or the processes that are coming from your provider let you spin up and shut down environments. because you'll spin one up for the project and it'll last for the life of the project, and then you can take it down. I think I might have presented a later slide a little earlier, but we'll make it work. Any questions, Rich, before I jump to the next one? All right. So we talked earlier about different CMMC levels, and from our perspective, helping people and talking to other customers about this. Level 3, interestingly, requires you to have different enclaves for different type of work. So if that's where you're headed, I know somebody asked a question about wanting to get to level 3. You're going to need an environment for the high security work, or the high compliance requirement work, and then something for the more administrative work. So as you're thinking about how to segment out your organization, some people might just need level 1 versus some level 2 versus some level 3, or you can use that as a set of stepping stones to make the change inside your organization a little more palatable. I'd also recommend, especially if you're doing things with internal resources, that you consider looking at implementing different control families. This allows you to kind of tackle low-hanging fruit while you're working on some of the bigger problems, and also have your internal staff get familiar with how to operate the security tools that are necessary to implement these different controls. All right, so some other segmentation. We talked a little bit about project by project before. This is a really popular offer of ours, and someone earlier asked the question about, what do I do if I'm just bidding? These sort of sales or proposal enclaves we've set up for a number of people. From a technology perspective, you're looking at something that's cloud-based or web-based. The distinction I make there between cloud and web-based is virtual desktops. So, a web-based enclave, you're only using browser-based solutions, whereas a virtual, or a cloud enclave, you're using virtual PCs, which lets you do more stuff with data. But it's nice in that it's relatively inexpensive compared to the everybody all at once approach. We can report a score, so we have an environment that we can get get approved, get certified. It's only got the salespeople in it, but when you set it up, you don't set it up so that you can't grow it, right? You have to set it up so that you can expand it as the works one. But it gives you a space to do that pursuit. It gives you a space to report compliance. It gives you a space to get used to how to use everything, without necessarily needing to take on a ton of cost all at once. Related to that is what we refer to as a headquarters enclave. So this would not only be the proposal development teams, but just generally the headquarters and back office workers, your execs, HR, etc. Again, this is going to help you drive the change you need in the organization to get everything in place. You can extend sort of the HQ enclave concept for organizations that have limited CUI requirements. So we've talked to a number of companies. It's a pretty common scenario where just the project managers or just the site managers or just the line managers, or there's some level of managerial or executive staff, are the only ones who have to see the CUI, even for them to deliver on the contracts that they need to deliver on. This is also really common in environments or in companies like construction or manufacturing. So you put the project managers or that managerial level plus the rest of the back office in the compliant environment. They all have a space to work together. And if you do have IT needs that don't include CUI for the remainder of the organization, those can stay in a commercial level 1 environment. So limited CUI access or limited needs or very small subsets of employees. It's also a really good starting place for companies that are going to roll this out more broadly, because again, it gets leadership to understand what's necessary. And it also, gives you a space to start tackling the process components of an 801.71 program. So I didn't exactly put this on the slide, but if you've got a culture change coming by putting this in place, you're used to an organization where everybody does whatever they need to do to get the job done, and these kinds of questions of following procedures and meeting controls aren't top of mind for your culture. This is a great way to get people to understand what does and doesn't have to change. And it's also a great way, again, if you put those business requirements first, to figure out how to preserve as much of that, get it done, high performance culture in your workforce, instead of the security requirements coming in and having to make everything harder to do. So then, if we've got headquarters done, or we don't need to do headquarters at all, then we really run into project enclaves. And project could be anything. It could be manufacturing lines. It could be construction sites. I think I mentioned earlier, if you figure out what your unit costs are for a compliant environment for a particular project, then you can take that into consideration as you're formulating your bids. But it's a great way to just say, hey, here's the place we need this. And if your projects are somewhat large, the employees that are on them are full-time, or employees are typically only on one project at a time. So, maybe it's only a 4-week thing, but when I'm on it, that's what I do. And I mostly need to communicate with a group in that project. Then, I've got this environment that matches my project needs. That's going to help you select systems. This might be something that can be run mostly using web applications and tablets. You don't need everybody to have a physical endpoint, so you can try to control costs that way. There's an added benefit here that if your projects are segmented from each other and you do have a security event, it's only going to affect the one project. You can use the project by project approach too to just roll out over the entire enterprise. So this is more of a change management approach than necessarily a segmentation approach. But again, if you got a culture change coming, the project by project approach isn't a bad way to go. You can start with projects where the culture, the project manager, or the requirements for the project really lend themselves to welcoming some of this organization and process, and demonstrating that can work before you tackle places where culturally it might be a little bit more unpopular. Of course, all of these approaches are also gated by where you've got a requirement. So, I'm not advocating that anybody not meet their requirements. But again, these are just ways to try to make the change palatable in the organization. We'll just talk really quickly about systems. So, somebody asked the question earlier about FedRAMP cloud environments. FedRAMP cloud environments are definitely one of the fastest ways to get things done. They also help organizations that may not have invested much in IT previously modernize in a hurry, right? There's cloud desktops, right? There's Windows desktops, there's Azure virtual desktops, there's virtual desktops you can run and other providers like Amazon as well. For organizations that might not need a ton of computing power for every worker, web access on a tablet, like an iPad, can be pretty cost effective compared to having to buy everybody PCs and secure the PCs. Those web and cloud only environments also have the benefit of being able to contain a lot of the security requirements to that web environment. So now I'm not necessarily worried about every laptop and desktop in everybody's home and hotel and office. So looking at the different tools that you actually need, again, starting with the business requirements, can help you slim down what it is that you need. A lot of sales environments that we put together are, start off as cloud-only environments. Okay, so final point, right. Obviously, all of these things that we've talked about here, we're mixing and matching. Um, these considerations don't exist in a vacuum on their own. So we could have a web-only enclave that's, level two, small subset of your organization accessing it. So that's based on your roles for a specific project. So when you're considering these things, considering them all in tandem is going to get you to the right answer the fastest. Um, I think that's about. Oh yeah, well we can get into resourcing options. Rich, is there any questions in the queue before I
Before
switch?
you get into reports, yes, we have some
Yeah.
questions here. First question: do you recommend a formal gap assessment before developing a plan, or can I start without one?
We'll tackle that with the resourcing slide, the next slide, but that's an excellent question.
All right, great.
Uh,
So then, next question. Are there differences in how subcontractors should approach compliance versus primes?
oh, yeah. That's an interesting one. And um, I mean, typically, I'd say the answer is that, most primes are a lot larger. They have much more complex systems that they need to get compliant. Um, but there's plenty of small businesses out there, especially service disabled veteran owned businesses that do go direct to the government on set aside programs. So they are primes. I would say that the major consideration is going to be size of the organization more than whether you're sub or prime. Also, um, I would how do I want to put this? We see different rates of adoption across different companies, of course, right? The market's going to move at different speeds depending on the needs of the individual companies. Um, and there are a number of subs that we've talked to that get pressure from primes. Um, and so if you're in any sort of working group or leadership group, where you can talk kind of freely with other organizations, other subcontractors, different primes are pushing, different parts of their supply chain at different rates to get this done. And so, in addition to worrying about what the government's going to ask for, you need to ask yourself what's going on in the subcontractor community. Um, I've worked at some larger consulting firms in my past, and when I think about a supply chain, and needing that supply chain to demonstrate any kind of experience, whether it's getting a technology certification like the latest set of Microsoft or Google certs, or it's something like this. If I've got 100 providers, the first 50 or the first 25 that get through everything they need to do are going to get more work, because I don't have to worry about running into a problem later. So pardon me. So as a subcontractor, I'd be concerned about what my prime's expectations are and what's happening in the workforce of subs to that prime, to make sure that I'm well positioned for future work when I'm thinking about how fast I want to do this.
Okay. Then next question have is, if I collaborate with a partner who's not compliant, will that impact my eligibility for contracts?
Um, so the CMMC requirements flow down. Um, and this is an interesting question because it does there. I don't know that there's a total black and white answer. The black and white answer is that if you have to share CUI to do the work, it absolutely will, because you can't share CUI with an organization that isn't capable of receiving it. So that's a responsibility that you'll have in the new rules, if you didn't already have it in the old ones. So um, again, that CUI flow analysis, which is something we can do for you, again at no obligation. What data do I have to send to them? What physical objects do I need to send to them? How do I collaborate with them? Is really going to be the granular answer to that question. But absolutely, just like every prime contractor is, going through and with various levels of pressure, asking subs to, demonstrate that they're ready for CMMC. Your partnerships, you're going to need to do the same thing. Um, but again, that CUI flow analysis will help you decide: um, am I sharing CUI with this partner? Um, and if I am, then yeah, you've got a consideration there.
Okay, great. All right. One more question. How do you typically work with companies that have existing IT teams?
Well, I mean, let me roll to the next slide because that's another resourcing based one.
Cool.
I can tell you, I can't speak for the whole community of providers out there. I can tell you we've got an approach where we divide your cybersecurity program up into different responsibilities with different teams. I don't know. Let me check. I'm not sure if it's on this slide. Um, all right. So it isn't on this slide, but for a managed service provider, if you decide to go externally, and I think they even mentioned this in the rule now, all managed service providers and external service providers should be able to share with you a customer responsibility matrix that tells you specifically what a provider like us does and what you all are on the hook for. So, providers like us have different levels of customer responsibility based on the different types of services that you want to buy, what your budget is, how much you want to outsource. So we do everything from really providing a lot of the high level architecture and guidance and policies, subscriptions to baselines and monitoring. So just the really securely focused stuff with a customer responsibility matrix that leaves a lot of the IT operations and even some of the security operations in the hands of the internal team, all the way down to we're the help desk. So there's definitely, and I don't think we're alone in this, right? So there's definitely providers out there that between the managed security, the CISO, the managed security, and then the managed service, the managed IT service, are willing to work up and down that spectrum. So absolutely doable. We've even had a couple of scenarios where company already had an external managed service provider that they really liked for their IT, but that company doesn't do security work and wasn't interested in expanding to cover CMMC. So we do the security work, and they do the IT work. Um, so in terms of resourcing, and Rich, could you remind me? I know there was another resourcing question that came a little earlier that I want to make sure I address here in these last 5 minutes. While you're looking at that, though, I'll keep going here. It's really internal versus external. I'm probably going to just take do nothing off of this slide because the rules here, I don't really think doing nothing is an option unless you're just going to get out of government contracting. And call us before you do that because there's ways to do this without breaking your bank. Rich, do you have that other question for me?
Yeah, the other question was, do you recommend a formal gap analysis, a gap assessment
Ah,
before?
right. Okay. So I'll address that when we hop over to external providers. So internally, you can also recruit a team. That's going to give you a lot of control and oversight, a lot of customization of how you want to do things. Um, you don't have to share sensitive information or give anybody externally access to your systems or your IP. And you build up internal expertise. I can tell you it's expensive, and for better or for worse, this is a field that still doesn't have a very large and well-developed workforce. So it is a bit of an uphill battle um, to build an internal team. But if you're large enough, there's certainly nothing wrong with insourcing, especially if that IT investment you see paying dividends in other parts of the business. If you go outside, there's really two different major groups of players that we've encountered. In our competitive journey here, there's managed service providers like us, and there's consulting services that are going to do more of a project-based approach. They both have their pros and cons. we went the managed service route when we entered this market. We do work for the government, so we're very familiar with project and staffing-based work. But when we designed our CMMC services 4 years ago, we decided to go with a managed service because we see the cost is a lot more predictable. And so I'll answer that question about requiring a gap analysis. Our first year under CMMC 1.0, we did perform gap analyses. But what we found was, unless you're a pretty large company with a really sophisticated IT infrastructure, the remediation plan to the gap analysis was build a new compliant environment, right? There really wasn't a lot of small remediation steps that made sense from a cost perspective for our customers. So they'd spend their money on a gap analysis, and then we'd suggest to them that they build something new, and they'd say, well, I spent my budget on the gap analysis, so let's talk next year about doing something new. So I think that's really a question of how big and complex is your current IT investment, and if you got a number of really special things in there, then doing that gap analysis is probably worth it. Again, I don't think we're alone in this, but our services, that CUI flow, and then an initial assessment of your current scope is included. We have to do that to even be able to give you a reasonable quote on our own services. So you can get sort of a gap analysis for no additional cost from a firm like us or our competitors. So again, if you got a really big pre-existing footprint, you've already done a lot of work, and so you just want to know kind of how do I stack up against the CMMC requirements. I already have a lot of policies, I already have a lot of procedures, I already have a lot of processes, I'm already enforcing a lot of this stuff. The gap analysis can make sense. Otherwise, I just find somebody who can help you out. Okay. I think that brings us to time. Again, if you've got specific questions that you didn't ask, or you've got a scenario you'd like to talk about, I'd love to help, especially small mid-sized companies that are really concerned about the price of this and how to get it done. I'd love to spend a little bit of time with you and help you figure out a path. And if we think we're the right path, we'll certainly love to work with you on that. And if we're not the right path, we'll certainly tell you what we think you ought to do. So happy to help.
Absolutely. Again, those resources to use. If you got additional questions you didn't get in, get it to marketing@ardlist.com. Also, if you're looking for information, you can visit us on our website, www.ardlist.com. I want to thank you for joining us today for the webinar series and give you an update here. We have the next line in our series, Your Compliance Companion, Microsoft GCC High Explained. That is happening on February 26th. Welcoming you to that webinar. We'll send you a link to be able to register in the next message we send after this meeting. So thank you again for joining. I appreciate your time today. Michael, as always, been a pleasure.
Yeah, good times, Rich. Thank you all, and thanks everyone for your questions. We'll see you next time.